His father's character was therefore the larger part of his education, as far as any single person affected it, and for that reason, if for no other, the son was always a much interested critic of his father's mind and temper. Long after his death as an old man of 80, his sons continued to discuss this subject with a good deal of difference in their points of view. To his son, Henry, the quality that distinguished his father from all the other figures in the family group was this: in his opinion, Charles Francis Adams possessed the only perfectly balanced mind that ever existed in the name. For 100 years, every newspaper scribbler had, with more or less obvious excuse, derided or abused the older Adamses for want of judgment. They abused Charles Francis for his judgment. Naturally, they never attempted to assign values to either. That was the children's affair. But the traits were real. Charles Francis Adams was singular for mental poise, absence of self-assertion or self-consciousness, the faculty of standing apart without seeming aware that he was alone, a balance of mind and temper that neither challenged nor avoided notice, nor admitted question of superiority or inferiority, of jealousy, of personal motives, from any source, even under great pressure. This usual poise of judgment and temper, ripened by age, became the more striking to his son Henry as he learned to measure the mental faculties themselves, which were in no way exceptional either for depth or range. Charles Francis Adams' memory was hardly above the average. His mind was not bold like his grandfather's, or restless like his father's, or imaginative or oratorical, still less mathematical, but it worked with singular perfection, admirable self-restraint, and instinctive mastery of form. But it worked with singular perfection, admirable self-restraint, and instinctive mastery of form. Within its range, it was a model. The standards of Boston were high, much affected by the old clerical self-respect which gave the Unitarian clergy unusual social charm. Dr. Channing, Mr. Everett, Dr. Frothingham, Dr. Palfrey, President Walker, R.W. Emerson, and other Boston ministers of the same school would have commanded distinction in any society, but the Adamses had little or no affinity with the pulpit, and still less with its eccentric offshoots like Theodore Parker, or Brook Farm, or the philosophy of Concord. Besides its clergy, Boston showed a literary group led by Ticknor, Prescott, Longfellow, Motley, O. W. Holmes. But Mr. Adams was not one of them. As a rule, they were much too Websterian. Even in science, Boston could claim a certain eminence, especially in medicine. But Mr. Adams cared very little for science. He stood alone. He had no master. Hardly even his father. He had no scholars, hardly even his sons. Almost alone among his Boston contemporaries, he was not English in feeling or in sympathies. Perhaps 100 years of acute hostility to England has something to do with this family trait. But in his case, it went further and became indifference to social distinction. Never once in 40 years of intimacy did his son notice in him a trace of snobbishness. He was one of the exceedingly small number of Americans to whom an English duke or duchess seemed to be indifferent, and royalty itself nothing more than a slightly inconvenient presence. This was, it is true, rather the tone of English society in his time, but Americans were largely responsible for changing it, and Mr. Adams had every possible reason for affecting the manner of a courtier, even if he did not feel the sentiment. Never did his son see him flatter or vilify, or show a sign of envy or jealousy, never a shade of vanity or self-conceit, never a tone of arrogance, never a gesture of pride. The same thing might perhaps have been said of John Quincy Adams, but in him his associates averred that it was accompanied by mental restlessness and often by lamentable want of judgment. No one ever charged Charles Francis Adams with this fault. The critics charged him with just the opposite defect. They called him cold. No doubt, such perfect poise, such intuitive self-adjustment, was not maintained by nature without a sacrifice of the qualities which would have upset it. No doubt, too, that even his restless-minded, introspective, self-conscious children, who knew him best, were much too ignorant of the world and of human nature to suspect how rare and complete was the model before their eyes. A coarser instrument would have impressed them more. Average human nature is very coarse, and its ideals must necessarily be average. The world never loved perfect poise. What the world does love is commonly absence of poise, for it has to be amused. Napoleon's and Andrew Jackson's amuse it, but it is not amused by perfect balance. Had Mr. Adams's nature been cold, he would have followed Mr. Webster, Mr. Everett, Mr. Seward, and Mr. Winthrop in the lines of party discipline and self-interest. Had it been less balanced than it was, he would have gone with Mr. Garrison, Mr. Wendell Phillips, Mr. Edmund Quincy, and Theodore Parker into secession. Between the two paths, he found an intermediate one, distinctive and characteristic. He set up a party of his own. This political party became a chief influence in the education of the boy Henry in the 6 years of 1848 to 1854, and violently affected his character at the moment when character is plastic. The group of men with whom Mr. Adams associated himself and whose social center was a house in Mount Vernon Street numbered only 3: Dr. John G. Palfrey, Richard H. Dana, and Charles Sumner. Dr. Palfrey was the oldest, and in spite of his clerical education, was to a boy often the most agreeable, for his talk was lighter and his range wider than that of the others. He had wit or humor, and the give and take of dinner table exchange. Born to be a man of the world, he forced himself to be clergyman, professor, or statesman, while, like every other true Bostonian, he yearned for the ease of the Athenaeum Club in Pall Mall or the Combination Room at Trinity. Dana at first suggested the opposite. He affected to be still before the mast, a direct, rather bluff, vigorous seaman. And only as one got to know him better, one found the man of rather excessive refinement, trying with success to work like a day laborer, deliberately hardening his skin to the burden, as though he were still carrying hides at Monterey. Undoubtedly, he succeeded, for his mind and will were robust. But he might have said what his lifelong friend William Mr. Evarts used to say: I pride myself on my success in doing not the things I like to do, but the things I don't like to do. Dana's ideal of life was to be a great Englishman, with a seat on the front benches of the House of Commons, until he should be promoted to the woolsack. Beyond all, with a social status that should place him above the scuffle of provincial and unprofessional annoyances. But he forced himself to take life as it came, and he suffocated his longings with grim self-discipline, by mere force of will. Of the 4 men, Dana was the most marked. Without dogmatism or self-assertion, he seemed always to be fully in sight, a figure that completely filled a well-defined space. He too talked well, and his mind worked close to its subject, as a lawyer should, but disguise and silence it as he liked. It was aristocratic to the 10th generation. In that respect, and in that only, Charles Sumner was like him, but Sumner in almost every other quality was quite different from his 3 associates, altogether out of line. He too adored English standards, but his ambition led him to rival the career of Edmund Burke. No young Bostonian of his time had ever made so brilliant a start, but rather in the steps of Edward Everett than of Daniel Webster. As an orator, he had achieved a triumph by his oration against war. But Boston admired him chiefly for his social success in England and on the continent, success that gave to every Bostonian who enjoyed it a halo never acquired by domestic sanctity. Success that gave to every Bostonian who enjoyed it a halo never acquired by domestic sanctity.